Earlier this week, as part of my work reviewing the new 8GB Raspberry Pi 4, I decided to walk the walk, so to speak. I unplugged my MacBook Pro, put it aside, plugged in the Raspberry Pi 4, and used it almost exclusively for an entire day to see how productive I could be on the new 64-bit PiOS with 8GB of RAM. I've never tried this before, but I recorded some vlog-style reactions as the day wore on. In the end, would I recommend the Pi 4 as a replacement for whatever computer you might be using right now? Probably not. But I did learn a lot. I learned a lot about the Pi 4, about Linux on the desktop, and about the tools that I rely on day to day to get my work done on my Mac. I have a link to a blog post with more details than I can cover in this video in the description below. And I put together an open source GitHub repository that lets you install all the different tools and apps that I tried out to replace the tools I use on my Mac. And there's a link to that also in the description below. Let's get started. Vlogging is definitely not my style, but I figured I'd do that for today for the experience of trying to run my digital life off this Raspberry Pi 4. Initially this morning I was going to start using the Raspberry Pi keyboard and the Raspberry Pi mouse, but I started doing that last night and I realized that they are, when you compare them to a keyboard like Apple's Magic Trackpad and all that, the trackpad and Apple's Magic Keyboard, it's not even close. If you're like me and you type a lot all day, every day, it's not really that great. To go to a plastic keyboard that is built for being cheap and being available. It's not a terrible keyboard by any means, but it's not great for typing on all day. If you're going to be a computer person like me, you need a keyboard that can actually withstand a lot of typing and not end up flexing and making a lot of noise, things like that. So, and the other problem I had with the mouse was it's so lightweight that the cable, when you stop using the mouse, the cable can sometimes kind of bend the mouse and move it. And so the mouse kind of moves around while you're not using it, just because the mouse itself is so lightweight and cheap plastic, which again, it's built for cost savings. It's not built to be the best mouse you can get. So it is nice to have it available. I think I bought this for $10 at Micro Center a year or two ago, and I've had it sitting in a pile of my Raspberry Pi projects. I'll show you over here. I have my many different Raspberry Pi bits and pieces, and over here is like the graveyard of Pi projects, present and past. So anyway, I was going to use those, but instead I'm going to go ahead and use my Apple keyboard and trackpad and see how they work with the Raspberry Pi 4. So anyway, I'm going to get things set up now. We'll see how things go. The first task for the day is just to get basic things like email working and make sure I can log into chat for work purposes and see where we go from there. So you don't always realize how many things you actually have plugged in your computer until you start trying to swap it out for something else. I have here, most things are plugged into the Pi now. You can see I grabbed an old Amazon Basics USB 3.0 USB hub, and I have my keyboard, my trackpad, my webcam, and my audio interface that has my microphone, the big microphone you see in the videos. And then I have the HDMI plugged in through a mini HDMI or micro HDMI adapter. Then I have the hard drive, the USB 3.0 hard drive is plugged into the Pi directly, just because with USB it's always better to plug any really important devices straight into your computing device, and that can sometimes solve power problems, things like that. And then I also have the network connected. And now back here, what used to be a nice organized bundle of cables is now kind of getting to be a mess. You can see there's still a bunch of other things I have not plugged in, including I use this CalDigit hub. It's a Thunderbolt 3 hub that works with a Mac. It'd be cool if the Pi had USB-C so that I could use a hub to do all this stuff and have power and everything, but right now it just uses USB-C for power. But there's still a few other things that don't quite work with the Pi 4, and I'm okay with that. Not everything that I can do on my Mac is going to be able to be done with the Pi 4. But it is interesting to see how many things you have connected to your computer you might not even think about once you connect them over the years. And then when you take the Raspberry Pi, which doesn't have a way of kind of using a hub or something like that, except for just a USB-C hub, it gets a little bit to be, as you can see, a rat's nest, and your desk is going to look a little funky unless you are really particular about your cable organization. Anyways, I'm about to boot it up and start working on the actual software side and see where I can go with it. So I'll see you after that. One quick note, just in case you're wondering this, is I have a 4K display over here. It's an LG 4K display. And if you are using the HDMI output on the Raspberry Pi, it maxes out at 30 frames per second, or 30 hertz, when it's connected to a 4K display over HDMI. You can see that up here. Those are the available refresh rates. So it's not so bad. I mean, the cool thing is it's 4K, and 4K means you can read text a lot more sharp, and video. You could watch a 4K video. I haven't tried that yet on the Pi. We'll see how that works out. But it is interesting just to see that. I know that I tried using my Mac with HDMI on 4K at 30 hertz for a while, and it was kind of made my eyes feel a little sore. I don't know why exactly, but I think when you're scrolling and when there's things that you're used to seeing smooth, when they start not being so smooth, it can kind of be grating. So we'll see how this works. I might end up switching it back to 1080p and do that at 60 hertz, just because the smoothness might be a little more important for me than the sharpness of the text. But it's something to keep in mind if you do have a 4K display and you're planning on using a Raspberry Pi with it. I was trying to get the Raspberry Pi to work well with 4K resolution, and what I found is basically that it's not fun at all to try to get a good kind of high DPI display mode set up with Linux in general, but especially on Raspbian, or now Raspberry Pi OS. You can turn on pixel doubling, but that basically makes it 1920 by 1080 and doubles the pixels. So it ends up actually being a little bit harder to read, in my opinion, than just doing a 1080p resolution and foregoing 4K. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to switch back to 1080p at 60 hertz because it's a little bit easier on my eyes, and text is not like teeny tiny. If you're expecting to switch from something like a Retina display on a Mac or any modern Windows laptop to just jump over to Linux and everything just works the same way, even on the Mac sometimes, but on Windows a little more, there are some cases where developers don't really code that well for high resolution displays, but because they're so standard there, most things work out of the box. On Linux, I'm finding a lot of applications don't respect system settings for it. You have to set high DPI mode in this app and that app and that app, and it's just not fun. It was like 20 minutes of time that I was spending trying to do that. I was like, forget this, I give up on it. I'm just going to go back to native resolution, 1080p, and I'll maybe dive into that again later. I know that in comments, people are probably going to be like, oh, it's so easy to do this and that. It's like, yeah, if you have your favorite distribution and you know it like the back of your hand already, and the hardware supports it, and you're using the right PC for it and the right monitor settings and all that. But that's one of the reasons why I normally stick with my Mac, is I don't have to spend a week getting up to speed on why high DPI works here and doesn't work here, and how to get it to work here and here and here. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that because that's one thing that I was excited about with the Raspberry Pi 4, being able to support 4K, even two monitors. Even though I don't use two monitors, I've used one for years and can't really go with two every time I try. My brain just doesn't work that way. But I was excited about it, and it's a little disappointing to see that the support is still quite lacking, and it's definitely not just click a button and you have it. It's click a button, then change some settings and tweak another setting here, and then find out this app doesn't support it. So we're a couple hours into this, and basically the first time that you try to do things on a Raspberry Pi that you're used to doing on your current desktop computer, you start realizing that there's a lot of software in the world that doesn't have any kind of ARM build whatsoever. And there are a lot of other programs that might have an ARM build, but it requires jumping through a bunch of different hoops, A lot of them are only compiled for Ubuntu, and surprisingly, there's a lot of software that's built for Windows 10 ARM, but not for Linux ARM, of course. So you end up trying to do Google searches for things like Twitter client ARM64. You find some Windows ones. You don't find anything for the Raspberry Pi because the Raspberry Pi OS has been 32-bit historically. So then you start searching for Debian, ARM, and all these different things, and you find a couple clients here and there. And finally, I found one, but you install it using a snap. And snaps, I don't know. I don't like the whole snap thing. You have to install Snap Daemon, and then you have to reboot your Pi, and then you can install things with Snap. I probably spent 20 or 30 minutes trying to get Dropbox to build on the Raspberry Pi, which with the 64-bit beta OS is running Debian 10 Buster, and that didn't really work out. In the end, I got almost all the way there. It was trying to download its proprietary blob that lets it do its file syncing and have the app interface and all that, and that kept erroring out. So I gave up on that and used rclone instead, and that actually works pretty well. Although the little hard drive I have means I can only mount my Dropbox on the disk instead of actually synchronizing everything. So I don't have the files locally, and browsing them takes a little time. But in general, most things I can get them working. It's just A, it takes a while to get it working. B, you need to know a lot about the way things work and how to build them to get them working. And C, usually you can't get it working exactly like you might be used to if you use Windows or Mac. If you are a Linux person, then a lot of these things you're used to it. And Linux people, I guess they like inflicting their pain on themselves. And the problem is there's so many of these things don't have a great user interface to them. The documentation is written from the perspective of somebody who knows what make is and how to compile things. And, whenever you find on a forum, oh, I can't do this, and then somebody responds, oh, yeah, just download the source and compile it. That's not a great solution for a lot of the people who are in the audience of trying to buy a less than $100 computer setup using a Raspberry Pi. So I think one of the things that I try to do whenever I do all these things is document everything that I did and how I did it, and hopefully the person who comes after me in my footsteps, they have an easier time of it. But I think it's just going to take time. Anybody who tries doing what I'm doing today is kind of a new explorer, because a lot of people don't really use a Raspberry Pi as a main development machine. They use it for hobby purposes or for making things. And what I found is it's actually fast enough to do most of the things that I need to do. It's just a lot of the handy utilities and apps that I like are just not there. You can't even find a compatible way to build it, much less find a download that you just download and install it. So that's one big takeaway I've had so far today. I'm going to keep plugging away. At this point, I can be pretty productive with my work environment because it's mostly GitHub and running Docker images and managing Git repositories and chatting on Slack. But there's still a lot of little things that I never realize, all the little keyboard shortcuts, all the little apps that are running in the background that I don't even think about on my Mac, all those little things that come together and make your productivity go down a bit when you try using a new system like I'm doing today. All right, so after way too much time spent on this problem, I finally figured out how to get the video from this Logitech webcam and the audio from my Behringer Euphoria sound interface. That's a USB 3 sound interface. I had some trouble because apparently the sound interface uses a different audio format, and you have to specify that on the command line, and it's kind of hard to find in the documentation how to find out which one you're supposed to use. And I kind of just got lucky because I found somebody else that had the same problem that I did on an FFmpeg mailing list. So I applied that change, and now you can hear my voice with this wonderful microphone and see my image with the pretty good webcam. Anyways, this is one of many reasons why I think a lot of people who get into, oh, could I use Linux for multimedia type things? It's great for certain scenarios. Like if I wanted to throw a camera in some place and leave it there for months doing a live stream, this is a great setup for that. You find your settings, you set it once, and you throw it out there and start using it, and it might run for years. On the flip side,
day to day, I'm trying to use Zoom, I'm trying to use Google Video Hangouts, I'm trying to use BlueJeans, I'm trying to record a video clip, I'm trying to stream with OBS or on Facebook Live. All these different tools have an interface that selects a camera and selects a sound source, and every single one has had a different problem trying to set up video and audio. Some of that is complicated by the fact that, of course, I'm using a USB 3 audio interface, which is supported, it's working right now, but it might not be fully supported by everything in Linux. And the problem is that on a Raspberry Pi, there's no native audio input, so you're going to have to use something, whether it's your webcam's microphone or something else. And even my webcam's microphone isn't recognized by all the software that I've tried using. So this is one of the big problems that I've had over time. Every time I try to get into doing the work that I need to do on a daily basis in Linux. This is one reason why I still stick with Final Cut Pro on my Mac, and I use Sound Studio and some other tools on the Mac. They just work. I've never had a problem where it just doesn't identify an audio interface or it doesn't let you select it. So that's one area that you'll have to get used to if you plan on using a Raspberry Pi as your daily desktop and you want to do any multimedia work.
One day in, I think I'm already giving up on trying to use this as my complete desktop replacement. It does do a lot of great things though. If you're just working in the command line using Docker, using GitHub and Slack and things, and you can live through a browser, command line, and code editor, that's actually not that bad. Most of the things that I was doing there, some of the open source development work I was doing, managing my repositories, communicating with the people that I work with, that all worked great. The problems came in when I tried to do a lot of my other kind of workflow-oriented things. Some of the tools I rely on for things like login, like 1Password, there are some substitutes for it in Linux, but a lot of them are a little clunky or might not be available on ARM64. Another thing that I really had trouble with was trying to do multimedia work on the Pi. There's a couple problems. One is that there's not a lot of great multimedia tooling for the Pi or for Linux in general. And of the ones that are available for Linux, most of them are not available for ARM. So you're limited to a very small set of GUI tools that make it easy to work with audio and video and recording and webcam inputs. There's a lot of good command line utilities, obviously FFmpeg and some of the other things that are built for the Pi specifically, but a lot of those require a lot of detail work and knowledge of how the underlying system works and what kind of devices are plugged in and things. It's a lot different than the experience I get on a Mac when I just open QuickTime Player and I select a video input and I click record. It's just not the same when you try to use a command line utility, find the right input, find the right settings for it, figure out that the format is incorrect and try to figure out how to find the correct format, figure out how to use one audio interface with a different video interface. There's all these different things that took a lot of mental effort just to get working. And then on top of that, I found issues with trying to do video chat and audio chat and things like that. All these little issues add up to an experience that's not that great for day-to-day use. I still love using the Raspberry Pis as headless servers, and I still am going to be doing that a lot. If you see over here on my desk, I have a bunch of different Raspberry Pi projects in the pipeline right now, and this Raspberry Pi right here, which is running pydramble.com right now because the other Raspberry Pi cluster, the Dramble, is actually on the floor down here. I'm sorry that it's so lonely, but I had to put it close to the power outlet. All the other outlets are taken up because I'm doing a lot of work on the Turing Pi cluster and some other projects. So as I'm moving things around, I don't have them all plugged in at the same time in the same place. But I still love using the Raspberry Pis for that stuff. I don't think it's kind of an ongoing meme, the year of the Linux desktop. I don't think we're going to be there, maybe ever. Part of the problem is that a lot of these apps do take a lot of resources to polish and make usable. And there's so many different Linux distributions, so many different interfaces, it's almost impossible to make something that's usable, all these different things. So I think my main takeaway is, unless you are doing purely development work, unless you can live inside of basically Docker and remote interfaces and a terminal and the browser, there's a lot of things that will hinder you if you try to use a Raspberry Pi as your main computer. So I don't know. I think that sounds a little negative. I think a lot of people could use a Raspberry Pi as their main computer. Or another thing that I've considered is having a Raspberry Pi always running in my house that has a VPN capability and all that, so I can get into it and do things that I need to do and have some shortcuts and have it connected to GitHub and other places so that I can do some work remotely or from my iPhone or something like that. But I don't think for somebody like me who is a pretty active producer of content and of web material and video and audio and things like that, I don't think it's the right platform for me. The one great thing in all this is that the Pi 4 is actually pretty fast. Outside of compressing video and doing things like that are CPU intense, most web browsing was great. Slack was a little slow, but to be fair, it takes about 2 seconds for Slack to switch tabs on my Mac, which has an i9 processor. So it's okay that it takes about 8 to 10 seconds sometimes to load on the Pi and Chromium. But most websites loaded very fast, GitHub and all that. It's noticeably slightly slower than my Core i9 Mac, but it wasn't at all difficult to use, and that was never a hindrance. So like I said, if you work on the web, if you work through a terminal interface and you do things remotely, the Pi is a great platform for that. There's really no hindrance at all. It's only when you start talking about GUI applications and being able to browse things like using a Twitter app and using a feed reader app and all those things, that's when it starts to fall apart. And that's where it kind of got to me, because a lot of these little tools are part of my daily activity on the computer, and not having them available really slowed me down. Anyways, I'm so glad you watched this video. I might do something like this again, maybe when the next Pi comes out or something like that, if we get a little faster CPU. And one really cool thing that's happening is supposedly Apple is going to announce that more Macs, if not all the Macs, are going to be using ARM processors. If that's the case, there might be more developers willing to build software for ARM. And if you build for ARM, the Raspberry Pi uses an ARM processor, the architecture is similar, and maybe more software could start coming to the Pi with a 64-bit ARM OS that was just announced in beta and that I've been using today. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing. I'll be doing lots more Raspberry Pi content, but also tons of other content on Ansible, Kubernetes, etc. And if you aren't a supporter, please consider supporting me on Patreon or GitHub. And thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.